So this is probably going to be about maybe 20, 25 minutes. All right. This next topic of discussion is all about genetic genealogy and its uses. This is one of my passions. It's one of my great loves, right next to cemetery documentation. So hopefully this will be useful information. So again, we have a little agenda here. If you want to take a quick picture of that, you're welcome to. But like I said, this is going to be pretty short. So first things first, what's in a gene? So I want you guys to think back to high school biology, right? Do you guys enjoy high school biology? Yeah, some people know. I was a science lover. I always have been. So this was a particular interest to me, but genetic genealogy is becoming more and more useful today as we get further into scientific and medical development. And we really do live in the age of genetics at this point. So we all know from high school biology that DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and God, that is a mouthful. But what that means is, first of all, we've got these 4 nucleotides, right? And we all learned about these. We've got those 4 bases, A, C, G, and T, right? I think they're adenine, guanine, thymine, I forget the other one, something like that. But
Close enough.
Yeah, right? Close enough, that's right. So each of these 4 bases pair up with each other and they make sequences. Now these sequences are as unique to you as your fingerprint. Everybody's fingerprint is different, and thus everybody's DNA is different. That's what makes us all individual, right? So DNA is kind of special in that way. So when these sequences start to line up, they get coiled into almost a wire-like kind of substance, and that's what makes our chromosomes in this picture here. So obviously these are not the chromosomes that you'll see under a microscope. This is just a cartoonization of them, but this is essentially what they look like on a karyotype. So you have 22 autosomes, and those autosomes come from both parents. And then you have 1 sex chromosome, and that determines whether you're biologically male or female. Right? And together you've got all 23 chromosomes, which is where we get the name for 23andMe, the DNA genetic testing company, right? So that's what that is based on. Now, this makes strings of DNA, and that DNA, or these chromosomes, is then found in the nucleus of your cells and in the mitochondria of your cells. And that's important where it's found because that tells us what kind of DNA it is and who it comes from. We're going to talk a little bit about that. So first of all, I want you to think to cellular biology, right? Think about how you had to learn the cell structure and you had to build a cell, right? You had to know all the little organelles that were in it and where the nucleus was and so on and so forth, right? So you've got your nucleus, and that's kind of like the brain of the cell, right? It sits right there in the middle, and it contains most of your genetic information. It contains most of these chromosomes, right? But then you have these little eggplant-shaped mitochondria that are floating around outside of the nucleus, right? Does anybody remember what the mitochondria does? So the mitochondria was the powerhouse of the cell, right? That's what gives you energy. It takes all the food that you eat and breaks it down into nutrients and energy for your body. And that's important. That's what powers you. But the big thing there is mitochondria also contains DNA, and guess where it comes from? 1 parent in particular, your mom. Mitochondrial DNA only comes from mom, and that is important because that tells us how we can track generations of genetic information, and it also tells us about various different health and genetic traits and carrier statuses and things that may come from mom versus from dad, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about how that works here in just a second. That's very important. So first of all, ATDNA, and is anybody having trouble viewing this? Because I know it's a little bit on the small side. So ATDNA is known as autosomal DNA. That's what that stands for. And autosomal DNA is found in the nucleus, and it comes from both of your parents, and then you inherit it further from way, way back, generations back. About 5 to 7 generations back on average is how far we can track autosomal DNA. You get that from almost everybody in your family. Grandparents, great-grandparents, so on and so forth. So that's pretty important. But then we've got the mtDNA, that's mitochondrial. You get that from mom, and that's kind of special, and we're going to talk about why here in just a minute. Y-DNA, aka male DNA, right, only passes from father to son on the Y chromosome. So only men are going to have this. And it is important to note here that all DNA inheritance is random. That's why your brothers and sisters don't have the exact same genetic fingerprint that you have, and vice versa. So whatever DNA you've inherited from mom and dad is not going to be 100% the same that your brother and sister got, even if you have the exact same two parents. There's always going to be some difference. Unless you're an identical twin, now that's a different situation. We're not going to talk about that today, but that is another possibility. So if you're a brother and sister, even if you have the same two parents, the takeaway here is your genetics are still going to be a little bit different. Let's talk about types of testing. So we're going to start off by talking about autosomal testing down here at the bottom, number 3. And the reason for that is because I want to save the mitochondrial and Y-DNA testing for later because they're kind of special. So autosomal DNA, as I was saying, you inherit that from almost all of your direct family members. And we can go as far back as about 5 to 7 generations, which is why when you get your results back from places like 23andMe or from Ancestry or MyHeritage or wherever you've tested, right, it's going to say, well, we predict that this person is your 3rd or 4th cousin, right? But have you noticed that it kind of stops predicting cousin relationships at about 5th or 6th cousins and it doesn't really go any further? The reason for that is because the genetic material that you would share with anybody further than that is either going to be non-existent or it's going to be so minute, so small, that it's not genealogically relevant anymore, right? So, I mean, if you share 0.5% of DNA with a person, can you really say that you share very much DNA with them? It's not very much. So, the next thing is autosomal DNA helps us to determine several things. The first thing is going to be ethnic ancestry, right? So where in the world do your ancestors come from? Why do you look the way that you do, right? Why do you have these particular physical traits? The next thing it's going to test for is biological family members. That's where you get your cousins, aunts and uncles, mom and dad, brothers, sisters, so on and so forth. Next is going to be physical and personality traits. And now we've gotten to the point where genetic testing can actually tell you if you can smell asparagus in your urine, or if you carry the trait for a cleft chin, or if you have a widow's peak, or if you like to wake up earlier in the morning. All sorts of different things. It's crazy the things that we now know are the result of genetics, and it was never a thing before. It's very interesting. Now, it can also tell you about health predispositions and carrier statuses, which is very, very important. Oftentimes what happens is that somebody will take one of these genetic tests, like 23andMe, and they'll find all of a sudden, oh, well, I'm a carrier for Tay-Sachs disease, or I'm a carrier for sickle cell disease, or anything like that at all. And that was the case for me. I actually found out that I'm a carrier for cystic fibrosis and never had anybody in the family with cystic fibrosis. Didn't know that I was a carrier for it, didn't know that my parents were any carriers for it or anything like that at all. It just popped up. But that's good information to have, because if I want to have children later in life, if I decide to have kids with somebody who's also a carrier for it, I have a 50% chance that my kids are actively going to have it. That's kind of a big deal. So, I mean, this is important. Now, let's see. Autosomal DNA is measured in something called centimorgans, and we often abbreviate that word as CM, right? So you'll see that a lot. So when you get your results back and you're looking at how much DNA you share with a person, don't so much pay attention to the percentage. What you really want to be looking at is that CM number, those centimorgans, because the more centimorgans you have with a person, the stronger and closer that genetic relationship is. So, for example, with a parent, you're going to share somewhere in the ballpark of about 3,000 to 4,000 centimorgans with them because you're a direct relation to them. But with something like a third or fourth cousin, you might be looking at somewhere in the ballpark of about maybe 200-300 centimorgans, and that's a big difference there, and that gives you a pretty good indicator of what kind of relationship there is. And it is possible to share no DNA at all with a third cousin or beyond. That does sometimes happen. Now, I will say that is rare. It's not very common. But it does happen sometimes. You are pretty much guaranteed that you're going to share at least some amount of DNA with your second cousin and up. So second cousin, first cousin, which means you share a set of grandparents, brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, parents and grandparents, right? All those people in that immediate little bubble right there, you're pretty much guaranteed you're going to share significant DNA with them. Now, let's talk about Y DNA really quick. So, we know that Y DNA is only on the Y chromosome, right? And that Y chromosome is only passed from father to son. So, ladies, hold on for just a second. We'll get to you in just a little bit. But this test for Y DNA compares that Y chromosome of 2 or more biological men to determine if they share a common male ancestor. This is one of the ways in which we track our ancient human migrations over the period of thousands of years, which is kind of crazy to think about. But this is how we do this now. And we can do the same thing for mitochondrial DNA with women. It works sort of the same way. It's a little bit different, and we'll talk about that in just a sec. But that Y DNA is passed from father to son. And it's important to know that when you take a Y DNA test, it does not determine paternal lineage. So if you're looking to find who your father is, it doesn't determine paternity. That's going to be a different kind of test, right? What this determines is if you and this other male person have the same Y chromosome, the same male ancestor that carried that Y chromosome and then passed it down the line to you. So that's how that works. Now, the Y chromosome, when it passes, is virtually unchanged. And that is how we track our human migration patterns over these thousands of years, because when it's passed, it just doesn't change. Or if it does change, it's very low. So we're able to look at these and say, this is a unique Y chromosome, this is a unique Y chromosome. They match up, they're almost identical. So yes, these two men do in fact share a common male ancestor. That's neat. So now, ladies, let's talk about you. So this is going to be interesting. So first of all, I want you all to know that first of all, women are genetically more diverse than men. But in addition to that, we're a little bit special because when a woman has children, she actually shares more DNA with her children, oftentimes, than the father does. And that's not because the woman is one that carries the child, it's just because of the way that mitochondrial DNA works and how it passes from mother to child. Everybody gets mitochondrial DNA. Doesn't matter if you're male or female. So everybody's going to have that. But women are the only ones that can pass it to their children. Men are not going to do that. So women, you get a gold star. But, so we know that that passes from mother to child, right? Now, here's the thing about this, right? When you get an X chromosome from dad, right? That X chromosome is going to be virtually unchanged, just like that Y chromosome. Same deal. But when you get an X chromosome from mom, that kind of changes some things a little bit. So what happens is mom's 2 chromosomes that are both X's get put into a genetic blender, wound up, and then all of a sudden we have this nice, shiny, brand new X chromosome that's now a combination of both of mom's, and that goes to a female child. That's crazy. So mitochondrial DNA works a little bit differently. It allows us to do the same basic things, the same tracking, doesn't work quite the same way. But it does allow us to have more genetic diversity, which is also really good, because if we just passed on the same genes, the same chromosomes all the time, we would all look alike. We'd all have the same traits, the same features. Life would be very boring. So there's our mitochondrial DNA. Let's see what else here. Oh, and that helps us, again, to determine if 2 or more women have the same common female ancestor. So these 2 charts right here actually show us how this works. This one here is for the mitochondrial DNA from mom. So this kind of shows you how you would inherit it from each of your female ancestors, even when you get that combined recombinated X chromosome. And then this one right here shows us how Y DNA works. It's along that one line, passed from father to son. So this person here at the bottom has the same Y chromosome that his great-grandfather had, and so on and so forth. And that goes back for many, many generations. I think we've covered everything on this one. Now, naturally, some people have some hesitations about how genetic testing works, and they want to know about that before they go through it if they decide they want to. So let's talk a little bit about requirements for genetics. So first of all, blood is no longer required for most genetic tests. Now I'm going to say most because there are still some that do require a blood sample. But for the most part, it's going to be saliva or a cheek swab at this point, which is going to be quicker, cheaper, easier overall on everybody. And you don't have to deal with any needles. Do I have anybody in here who doesn't like needles? So next thing is comparisons. So genetic testing really is all about comparisons. You're taking the sample that you've given and you're comparing it to people around the world to find who you match up with, or your genetic ancestry and things like that. Or you're also comparing it to them in terms of their medical and carrier status conditions, right? So ethnicity. DNA companies like Ancestry or 23andMe, they will take what's called reference samples from native populations around the world, right? And that will give them an idea of what these group of people's chromosomes and DNA look like, right? And then they'll compare yours to all of these different reference samples around the world. And if they match in a significant way to any of these populations, then we know your ancestors likely came from this area of the world. That's how that works. Now, it is important to note as well that we have some populations around the world that have not been tested. They don't have any samples for them yet. Like, we don't have very much at this point from places like New Zealand or Papua New Guinea or places like that. So you may not see very much pop up from there, but hopefully in the future we will have those samples. Now, it works basically the same way with biological family. If you're looking to find cousins and so on and so forth, we do the same comparison. But you can't know if you're related to somebody through one of these tests unless they have also tested. Okay? So I've had a lot of people come up to me and say, hey, can I just go and take this test and find out if I'm related to my cousin or my grandma or whoever the case may be. And I ask them, well, have they tested with the company? And they say no. No, the answer is going to be you cannot find out unless they have also tested, because we need to have their sample in order to compare yours, right? So if they haven't tested, get them to test if they want to. And if they have, or it's with a different company, like let's say, for example, you tested with Ancestry and your cousin tested with 23andMe, right? Normally, if they're on different websites, you're not going to match up. Here's a way you can do that. GetMatch. GED, GetMatch. GetMatch is a website that allows you to upload your DNA file from whatever website you have chosen to use, and the other person can upload theirs from a different website, and you can compare your genetic DNA files, right? So this is how we can do that without going to test with the same companies and spending more money, right? So GetMatch is a wonderful website. It is not currently the most user-friendly thing in the world, I will tell you that. I've even had a little bit of trouble trying to make files match up to each other and get people connected. It is not the easiest thing, but if you're interested in that kind of thing, do give it a try. You don't have to have another person that you know upload their file. You can just upload yours, and it will automatically tell you who is already on the site that you're related to. It will just use and compare the information that it already has, which is great. Now, let's see. Yes, a DNA file will only exist for people who have had testing done. I've had some people who say, oh, the government has my DNA. The government only has your DNA if you have committed a crime or if you have been in a job where you had to provide fingerprinting or DNA database sampling. So just keep that in mind. You do have to have a genetic file on one of these sites or on GetMatch in order for that to actually show. Laws and its uses. So let's talk about GINA over here on the left a little bit. GINA stands for the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Okay. Now that's a mouthful. But GINA essentially protects individuals from genetic discrimination by health insurers and employers. That is a very broad, overarching kind of definition. GINA includes a lot of different things, and that's great. It has given us some key protections. Unfortunately, there are some loopholes that still exist within this law, within GINA. We do have a variety of organizations that are working to get those loopholes kind of closed up. They are lobbying for those things. So if you see or hear about that kind of thing, make sure you do your research on it, listen to it, figure out what's going on, be well informed, right? Because having more information, in my opinion, is never really bad. HIPAA, we all know about HIPAA. We've heard so much over the years about HIPAA, right? HIPAA regulates the uses of genetic testing that are done through a medical office, right? Now, here's the deal. This rule, this law for HIPAA does not apply to DTC testing. And that's just a funny acronym that stands for direct to consumer. So that's going to be things like Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, Family Tree, so on and so forth. If you can go online and buy that kit from one of these websites, HIPAA does not cover it, does not protect it. Okay, that's only for genetic tests that are done through a doctor's office. Just be aware of that. We are working with GINA to try to, like I said, cover those loopholes and get more protections like that, but they don't currently exist. Now, with that being said, these DTCs are always going to ask for your permission. They're not going to share your genetic DNA profile with people that you don't want it shared with. They're going to ask you up front, do you want this information to be available to us for research purposes? And do you want this information available to the people that you match up your genetic cousins and aunts and uncles and things like that? You will have the opportunity to say yes or no. That is entirely your right, your decision. And if there ever comes a point when you realize, hey, I wasn't asked about this and it was just done anyway, it is entirely within your right to say and do something about that. And you should, because that is your information. Make sense? Okay. Next, let's talk about some uses, family and health. We know that we can use this to determine biological family, ethnicity. We can confirm family stories with it, which is great. We can discover carrier statuses and health predispositions. So you can determine if you have a predisposition for type 2 diabetes or late onset Alzheimer's or macular degeneration, all sorts of different things. It's fantastic. Now, another new type of use with genetic genealogy is something called IgG, and that stands for Investigative Genetic Genealogy, and that's a mouthful. This is where the law comes into play. This is how we've started to catch criminals and solve cold cases. Now, do I have anybody in here that loves forensic files or cold case files or anything like that? Yeah. That's a woman thing. Don't know why, but yeah. So this has become the new way to catch criminals who leave DNA behind at a crime scene. This is how we're catching murderers and rapists now, which is fantastic. This is how we're solving cold cases. This is how we caught the Golden State Killer. That's great. So this is fantastic. Love this. Getting into that a little bit more. Let's talk a little bit about a quick case study and then we'll be done. So I've titled this Finding Dad, Bertie County. So just to kind of bring it home for everybody. So a while back, I had a client reach out to me and say, I have already tested with Ancestry and I am 30 years old and I was adopted at birth. I've already found my biological mother, but I want to find my biological father because I'm not really getting trustworthy information from my biological mother. So I don't really know who dad could be. That happens. It happens a lot. So I said, okay, well, if you've already tested, then you've got the hard part over with. So let's take a look at your information and see what we can do. So we knew right off the bat, and I'm sorry because I know that text is super small. We knew right off the bat that she had several close matches, right? So we looked at those. She had a great aunt, and then there were lots and lots of second and third cousins. So what we did from that point is we divided those cousins and those matches for mom's side. We took her matches away because we knew these matches are related to mom. We don't need to worry about them, right? So we're narrowing our pool down. So now we get to the matches that are just dad. Well, first thing you want to do is look at the closest match possible. And the closest one she had was a great aunt. So we look at great aunt's information. We see her name. We see how old she is. We can see her genetic information. And I then take that information and I start building a skeleton tree, is what I call it. It's like a reverse family tree, and you're getting the basic direct kind of people. So we go and do that, and we end up narrowing it down to this set of great-grandparents who had 6 sons and 13 grandsons, right? So that sounds like a lot. It can be. It depends on how far you have to take things sometimes. Sometimes you go through all of them and you find out that it was actually none of them and there was a half-brother that nobody knew about. So, sometimes you gotta dig a little deeper. That's okay. So we go through these 6 sons and we know that because they're coming from the set of great-grandparents, they're part of an older generation. They're not likely to have been her father at her 30 years old, right? So then we start looking at the grandsons. And we're putting together bits and pieces of information. I get in contact with the great aunt. She was very helpful, a wealth of information, and was more than happy to help out. We start talking about family secrets, possibilities that maybe there's a grandson out there that might have something to do with this. And she ends up helping me narrow it down very, very much. So at the end of everything, we've come to this half-brother of hers that the family found out about in adulthood. And they met him and they knew who he was. And they did have it confirmed that he was a half-brother. He did not grow up in North Carolina. He actually grew up with his mother in another state. And he went on to have a son himself. So what the family did not know is that the son of this half-brother came back at some point in time to Bertie County almost exactly 30 years prior. So we go and do some research on him. We find out he's got the exact same family and friend connections in this area and a variety of other things that we're putting together all of this kind of circumstantial evidence. And then we start looking at pictures of him and comparing the two. And she looks an awful lot. So that's eventually how we found her father. She is in the process of trying to contact him and actually get a connection going there and hopefully have some testing done to confirm that relationship. But we're 98% sure that he is definitely. So isn't that amazing how these stories and connections just twist and turn over time? All these things come out people don't know about, and then suddenly you end up with new family connections you never knew. It's amazing. So that is my story for you guys today. So I'm pretty sure we are at the end here. Do we have any questions? Well, thank you all very, very much for being here. I greatly appreciate it. I would be happy to take any questions or talk to you at this point. So if you want to talk, just come on up. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hey,
Share that